I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Please share with friends and like. We're doing something a little bit different this week, sort of some local history, but I think it won't take long for people to recognize that there's some interesting things to learn from this history for all of us. I will briefly mention, support for the show is gratefully received at Subscribestar. The link is in the YouTube video description. If you would like to support the show, the main bulk of supporters support the show with $5 a month. Cheap, but it adds up and lets me pay my graphic designer and so forth. Okay, all right. We have a guest who's going to walk us through this. Welcome, Seneca.
How's it going, YouTube? How's it going, Twitter? It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Radlib, for inviting me on.
Yeah, and you've prepared a presentation. You're going to be doing most of the talking, but before we get going, I just wanted to say that part of the reason why it really makes sense for me to host this discussion of the French in Missouri, and you're actually covering it a little more broadly than that, but the French in the Midwest, is that I gave a speech at the Old Glory Club conference last summer called Know Your Ground. And I kind of went down some rabbit holes about the myth of the Amerindian genocide and various things. But the point of the speech, the point of everything I was doing, was to sort of clear the way for Americans and encourage Americans to know their own history, to some degree, literally know the ground they're on, like the geology that they're standing on, the history of what happened before them, who was here, who lived in the place you live now, who lived before, in terms of Amerindians, but also, what is the history of the Europeans in the area you live. So for me, this show is a way of not just of walking the talk, right? I encouraged everyone to know your ground, and this is something that I've been learning bits and pieces of, but Seneca is going to give us a much more thorough and comprehensive view of the French who left behind such a legacy. I'll wait for, there's a shocker in this for me. There was a real shocker in this information for me, but I'll just mention that I am surrounded in St. Louis, not just in St. Louis, but when I go to Sainte-Geneviève, which my wife worked in for a summer, so we like to go there sometimes for Jour de Fête and so forth. But in other places in Missouri, I'll just run into French names, French street names. People, I'll mention it at some point, a gentleman whose grandmother spoke to him in French because she came from these French people. She descended from these French people who never left, so their legacy is really, really strong, despite, something we'll get to. Anyway, with that, anything you want to say before we get into the slides, Seneca, or just rock on it?
Yeah, so kind of going off of what your Old Glory Club speech was about last year, I'd like participating, well, not necessarily participating, but watching a lot of the online debate on the right.
Mm-hmm.
To me, kind of feels like in a lot of cases, we're kind of missing the point. We want these kind of deep-rooted identities for ourselves, and that's a good thing to ask for. That's a good thing to want and desire. It's healthy. It's human. As a Catholic, I believe that all peoples deserve to have a culture and a society and a place to call their own. But we're trying really hard, maybe unintentionally, to resurrect these kind of old forms of identity, right? And that's reasonable, I would say. But we live in a different time and in a different place. And part of the struggle I think we're going to have trying to create new identities for ourselves and understanding our place in this modern moment is realizing that a lot of the elements of the past aren't going to work as well as they did anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to figure out what was good from that time and who came before us, and then figure out, okay, this thing was good. I like this. This thing not so great. How can I apply that to my own life?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's the classic Christian
There's a creative exercise of not just trying to do some kind of zombification exercise, right?
exactly.
We're gonna LARP as 16th century whatevers, you know, whatever our great grandparents were, what we imagine them to be. Um, it's we don't really want that. We want a creative engagement with the past that that is able to breathe life into the present and the future, right? And not
Mhm.
hold it, not sort of hold it down, right? Hold it back.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Okay, shall we get going?
Yes, yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so
So,
turning to the
yeah.
first slide. There we go. All right. So to be clear, what oh you said through 1770. You actually go beyond that. I think your title
A
isn't
little
quite
bit.
right. Yeah. But anyway,
Yeah.
this I
The
guess
French occupation part was 1770. There's some
got it. Okay.
complicated things that I will go into a little bit with
Yeah.
that, but yeah.
Anyway, so just to frame what we're doing here, this is the main time that the French are. It's not about when they're here. I mean, I guess 1550 is when they start being here, but they don't disappear in 1771. That's not why you put those dates here, right? It's that
No,
these are the years, pretty long time here, 220 years, right? 220 years where the French have the dominant European cultural force that's going on in this area in the Midwest, right?
yeah, it's
Yeah.
more about political control. This timeline is about political control.
Ah, got it. Okay.
But yeah, like during that time though, like you can take the French influence and go from the very start all the way through the Spanish period. I'll for reasons I'll get into later down in the podcast.
Okay. Well, let's keep going then. So, give us
Sweet.
our quick overview before we drill down.
Yeah, so and to really start with French America, with French in the Midwest in particular, we have to start with a man who might be very familiar to your Canadian audience, named Jacques Cartier. Mr. Cartier was born in 1491 in Saint Malo, and he's the prominent explorer of the French in the very beginning times of the 1550s, 1530s.
Mm-hmm.
So he was commissioned by the French government for several different voyages to the New World to explore the great big continent, the Western Hemisphere, right? Because things are heating up quite a bit in Europe at this time. I did a very brief kind of overlook of what was exactly going on with France, the Kingdom of France at this time, while preparing for this stream, and
Mm-hmm.
you figure out real quick that the French were in some very heated competition back in Europe.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, France was involved in up to like 3 wars at this point, with other different countries. Most prominently, I think they were on like the third or fourth Italian War or something like that. And they were also having problems with the Spanish, their southern neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously the Spanish had discovered, the New World. They were the ones who were really exploring it at this time, and they would go on to conquer about 2/3 of it. So the Central America and Southern America, um, and the French wanted in on the market basically
Yeah.
for several different reasons. One would be mercantilism. Mercantilism, for those who need a brief overview in the audience, is the idea that the amount of gold you have in your treasury is indicative of how much power you have, because gold is one of the easiest resources to transfer directly into military power.
Mm.
Um, you can spend gold really easily on, recruiting and training troops and arming them, feeding them. It was indicative of empire, more or less, at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And the Spanish were extracting tons of gold and silver out of South America and even in Central America as well at this time,
Right.
using these large silver and gold mines that they had discovered. So the French were thinking at this time, well, we might as well try to cut in on the market.
Mm-hmm.
The If we can find gold and silver inside of North America, we would monopolize the resource and then also cut in on what the Spanish were doing. They also wanted to find the Northwest Passage. This is a very common
Yeah, yeah.
theme you'll find with North American exploration. They wanted to find this passage that would cut right through the continent to connect trade with China.
Yeah,
Again,
and
for
just to not forget how the whole crazy era started, which was Christopher Columbus trying to find a way to get to a faster way to get to Asia, right? Or another way.
exactly
Yeah, yeah. So
another way, yeah.
that even once we realized, oh, Christopher Columbus did not actually land in India, even though we still call them Indians. Once the Europeans figured that out, they didn't give up. They thought, hey, there's lots of rivers and there's probably a way through, right?
Mm-hmm. So hopefully, right?
Yeah.
They monopolize that nice trade with China because,
Yeah.
again, if you're trading with the Chinese, you're bringing back gold, and if you can bring back gold
Mhm.
cheaper, that's more you have left over. And it also, this is a little bit of speculation on my part, but I'm thinking that probably the reason why the French wanted to find the Northwest Passage so bad, like everybody else, is not only could they bring in their trade for cheaper, they could also put tariffs and taxes on any trade from foreign countries that might want to go through as well.
Yeah, right.
So again, more gold in the coffers.
Control the portal.
So
Yeah.
control the portal. Yes. So to kind of steer back to what Cartier is doing,
And
after
by the way, are
Cartier,
you still doing the opening timeline? It sounds like you're getting down into details. Should I be moving the slide here?
yeah, go on ahead and move the slide.
Here we go. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. So Cartier goes on a series of 3 expeditions over the course of about 7-8 years or so to the New World. The first one, though, and is the most important, right? The first and the second one. The first one is when he actually discovers the estuary of the St. Lawrence River.
Hmm.
This allows them to obviously make their way into the interior of the New World and into what is now Canada and the Great Lakes region of the United States.
Hmm.
They also find the first sets of Indians that the French encountered, which is the Mimac, off of I think it was the Anacostia Island in the estuary. Um, and this is kind of the first indication of the French that they have allies that they could have in the region. We'll go
Hmm.
back into it later a bit more, but the French would differ pretty extensively to the English in their relations with the Indians. They always wanted to keep on friendly terms with them. Now that kind of goes a little pear-shaped with Jacques Cartier because, well, he does end up kidnapping a Huron chief in his second voyage near where I think it was Funk Island. Yeah, I think so. The reason why is because this particular Huron chief was telling him about this mythical village called Stadacona. And Stadacona, I think that's how it's pronounced, supposedly was like the El Dorado of North America. This very rich, powerful village that was somewhere to the north of what is modern day Quebec City. And Jacques Cartier was like, oh, the French king is going to want to hear about this, which at the time was Francis the First. But kind of to cut a bit of a long story short, because I know I'm trying to be aware of time. The He ends up taking the chief to France against his own will, and presents him to the court after his second voyage to discuss what Stadacona was like. They never did find it though, even after very extensive searching across the area north of what is now Quebec City. The kind of the result of Cartier's expeditions is that we really get the foundations of French power in North America. This is the beginnings of what would be called New France later on. Part of his expeditions, especially the third one, was to found cities in North America, putting colonists in there so that the French could have an actual place to project power. Um, so Quebec City, the foundations of Quebec City would be late at this point in time, and Montreal would also be founded during this time as well. Um, and then to kind of broaden out a little bit more, the Spanish De Soto were also kind of in this area as well.
Hmm.
Not necessarily in kind of North America, but like cutting through like the southern part of it, right? So what is
The,
now
the
like
the
Florida,
yeah, the
Georgia.
southern part of North America. Yeah.
Yeah, they were also in the area. They would kind of clip the boot heel of Missouri on their explorations, and we'll see that on the next slide. Because I have a couple of maps and stuff like that for the edification of our viewers. But again, the main reasons why France was kind of establishing this is because they wanted to cut in on the holdings of other countries. They wanted to be there first. And you'll notice, though, that the French get very distracted after this.
Hmm.
Colonization, initially, there was this burst of colonization, but then it just kind of peters off. There were still colonists coming to the New World from France. They were coming in dribs and drabs here and there and stuff like that. But France's attention gets pulled away from the New World and trying to monopolize its resources
Okay.
because of various different political disputes that were going on at this
Yeah,
time.
I'm picturing the
Uh,
Jeremy Clarkson meme, Seneca. Oh, the New World. Anyway,
exactly,
back
right?
to you, back to European politics, right?
Exactly. As it says on the slide, like political infighting was really kind of starting to take off during like religious infighting was starting to take off
Right.
during this time,
Hmm.
with the wars of religion. And then also there was another set of Italian wars. I don't even know how many Italian wars the French had. There
Hmm.
was a lot. But also later on, you would see that there was this unstable kind of government there was this transition that was happening in motion towards the end of the 1500s, between the Valois dynasty of France and the Bourbon dynasty, the Bourbon dynasty, I should say. So there was instability there that was
Yeah,
drawing the French attention away.
this is very interesting. I've never seen a presentation of the information this way, but it'd be really nice to see immigration from the old world to the new world by English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and so forth over time. I'm like picturing the graph in my head how it would be structured, but I don't know the information. What I do know, because I talked a bit last summer about um, the interactions between, especially, well, the Europeans and the Native Americans. Um, it seems like the English actually kind of got a late start. That is, if it wasn't for what you just described, if the French had started with that early lead and really sent more and more people over, it could have been a really different story because
It's possible,
The
yeah.
Puritans don't come until a bit later, I think, um, and other waves of English immigration. So
Yeah,
um,
I think Jamestown too was founded only in 1607,
yeah,
something like
exactly.
that,
Like
somewhere
it's
around
sort
there.
of. I'm looking at the years. I'm looking at the history of the early Spanish and French and everything, and then the English. And I'm like, oh wait, so the English didn't really come until like 100 years after Columbus. They really started to try
Right.
to make a real presence. There was a century or more where the French or the Spanish could have just really dominated North America and made it so that they were the dominant culture instead of the English culture. And why didn't they? Well, we don't have a full explanation of all of it, but I think you pointed to part of it on the French side, right? For various reasons, they stopped being interested in sending a bunch of people over, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
with the Spanish too, they were always more focused on extractive enterprises.
Yeah.
There
Right.
there
Right.
was colonization, obviously, but they were mostly here for the gold and silver, which would come back to
Yeah.
haunt them later on.
As opposed to like really what do you call it, settlers, right? The English sent
Mhm.
settlers and the Spanish didn't do so much of that, and the French did, which you're describing here, but as we'll see, not in the huge numbers that the English eventually did in the 1600s. Okay, next slide.
Yeah. Just wanted to do kind of a quick note though.
Okay.
During this time, though, the French do with New France as we're going into the early beginnings of the 1600s. You'll you'll kind of start to notice that there's kind of several main themes that kind of French policy begins to lean towards in like 1608 or so, just as the English arrive. And that is, I've kind of summarized it there with the establishment of New France. Expansionism, Northwest Passage, we've already talked about that one. The Jesuits, the fur trade, rumors of the El Dorado with Stadacona
Mm-hmm.
of North America. And I've already talked about the Northwest Passage part. But Jesuits, too, is something that you don't necessarily hear a lot with the French, is that there was this real missionary zeal that the French had to
Mm-hmm.
convert the population of Indians that they had just had. That was a good chunk of the reason why they were trying to expand too.
Mm-hmm.
And the fur trade as well. The fur like furor that would kick off in Europe in the 17 and 1800s was really beginning to start right about here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the United States had all of these very high quality furs that you could take and make into garments, right? So like felt hats and like anything basically you can imagine, fur coats for the rich and stuff like that. The French figured, there might not be much gold later on, but we have kind of a pretty good source of money, which is in this
Mm-hmm.
case would be the fur trade.
Yeah.
So yeah, so
Okay.
we could go on
Ready?
to the next slide.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So Jacques
So
Cartier.
yep, this is the first two voyages of Jacques Cartier himself, and there's a picture of the man on the left hand side over there. Um, Cartier doesn't really go beyond the St. Lawrence estuary or the St. Lawrence River itself, but he is foundational for later French exploration of the region because the St. Lawrence River empties out into the Great Lakes. And while there's no direct path from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi, you can go down several different rivers like the Fox River, the Wisconsin River, and you can end up in the Mississippi River, which is how the French get there.
Right.
Yeah. So if you want to go to the next slide.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And then broader picture about what's going on during this era, right? About the different explorations. Mostly we're going to be focusing on the eastern end of the United States with this one. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a picture on the left-hand side of Hernando de Soto himself. And you can see
Mm-hmm.
his little expedition down there in the red near
Mm-hmm.
Florida, or at least where we think he was.
Mm-hmm.
As you can see, he just barely clips the boot heel of Missouri. So you could, I guess, technically say that the Spanish were in the Missouri area, looking around and see what was going on. But the DeSoto expedition would kind of end in tragedy because the man himself would die
Yeah.
on the expedition due to some kind of sickness, I believe.
Right.
Um, and then, like, his
I
expedition was very quickly canceled.
I just want to comment real quick for those who might be watching who aren't Americans. It can be a little hard to comprehend the vast distances you deal with in North America. Um, and when you think about DeSoto, not having like roads, cars, trucks, right? This is a huge area. If you wanted to follow that path today as best you could using modern roads, it would take you, I don't know, a couple days of driving to follow that squiggly red line. I don't know, maybe
Yeah.
not that much, but
Pro-
yeah, I mean, this is a big journey by foot, a
yeah.
really massive journey.
Probably.
It's really kind of impressive. I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, wow, how do they do that?
Yeah. And they're hacking it through virgin forests, more or less. Like the
Yeah,
Indians were clearing some of it, as the Puritans would kind of testify to.
right.
But like down here in those heavily wooded areas, I mean, there's hostile Indians. It's
Yeah.
completely new ground. Nobody has really um, been through those forests before, and they're thick too. I remember hearing stories. I think from some of the Indian tribesmen that I know that like the woods were so thick in those kinds of areas that a squirrel can go all the way from Missouri, like St. Louis area, all the way up to where Chicago is now, just hopping along the branches and not
Mm-hmm.
even touching the ground.
Yeah.
So it's a hard journey. So if you want to flip the slide
Oh,
next, right?
yeah. Okay.
So kind of continuing on again, the French kind of interest kind of peters out.
Mm-hmm.
They really spend a lot of the time leading up to the next exploration, the Marquette Joliet expedition. They spend a lot of that time simply consolidating, like getting more colonists in, founding industries, and making sure that the next leg of the journey would be easier. They'd have supply bases established and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
The next expedition that would actually go down the Mississippi River would be the Marquette Joliet expedition. Now, a little bit on the actual people involved themselves. Father Jacques Marquette was a very zealous Jesuit polyglot. Like I was saying before, the Jesuits in this time were very intent on trying to convert the native population. He spoke like 5 to 6 Indian dialects,
Wow.
which you could basically say those are like all different languages. It's thought of that a lot of these Indian languages come from a root language, but they splintered off into all these different ethnic languages. So some of this might as well be different languages. Anyway, and Louis Joliet
Oh, wait a sec.
was
Before you leave the Jesuit Father Marquette there, I just wanted to
yes.
mention, you know, how historically accurate, I don't know, but there's a movie called Black Robe, which the main character is a Jesuit missionary coming to leaving the old world, going to leaving France, coming to the new world to be a missionary to Indians. And it shows his journey from the old world to the new world, but mostly in the new world, interacting with native tribe, Amerindian tribes. Um, and It's a favorite movie of mine. I find it very
I'll have to
moving,
watch that at one
and
point.
yeah, and I think if you find this kind of interesting that these French were coming with this missionary effort, I think you would find that movie interesting. It's it's a secular movie, I guess, but I thought it really worked as a Christian viewer. I really loved it. Um, uh, and it's kind of brutal because he's dealing with the Native Americans who were brutal in how they treated each other and how they treated
Mhm.
any Europeans that got in their clutches sometimes. So, but anyway, highly recommended. I think it brings a lot of color to this story to watch that movie.
For sure. Yeah. I will have to watch that myself if
Yeah,
I ever get the chance between all the reading and research that I'm doing. But anyway,
Joliet.
so Joliet was the hardscrabble Canadian voyageur. So for context, right, a voyageur during this time was basically a French boatman. The French had two different kinds of explorers. They would have the voyageurs, and they would also have the coureurs de bois. Uh, the voyageurs are more like the boatmen, like I just said, but the coureurs de bois are you could think of them like English long hunters, right? So fur trappers, hunters who would go into the wilderness and they would, shoot their prey and they would come back and bring all their furs and the meat to market.
Mm-hmm.
But Joliet really kind of knew the ground and he knew what like river travel was like, and so he was essential for this expedition to really even get to where it was, which was to explore the length and the breadth of the Mississippi River,
Mm-hmm.
because at this time the uh, the French knew that the Mississippi went somewhere to the sea. They had no
Mm-hmm.
idea. They were thinking that the Mississippi eventually dumped into the Gulf of California on the other
Mm.
side of
Wow.
on the other side of Mexico. But obviously, it didn't turn out to be the case. But they figured that out during this expedition. They would go all the way down to the Arkansas River when they would reassess, and they would figure out real quickly that, well, it dumps out into the Gulf of Mexico. So they had answered the main kind of question of their exploration. But during this time, they would pass Missouri. And they would note that there was another big river that they were also kind of thinking, well, is that the Northwest Passage? Which we would call nowadays the Missouri River. I believe they were the ones who actually named it after a local tribe that they had discovered in the area called the Missouria. And they would go back, though, and report their progress in Quebec City and what ended up happening on that expedition. So you can kind of see the route there that they had taken from Green Bay, what is now Green Bay, to the Fox River, the Wisconsin River, down the Mississippi, and then to Missouri. They would also contact a Peoria Indian village during this time, which would eventually become a state historic site called the Illiniwinick Village State Historical Site. And it would be this tribe of Indians that would actually point them around to the different directions, and they would help out with the expedition, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Another kind of honorable mention that I want to make is the La Salle expedition. So René Robert Cavalier de Sieur de La Salle was the man who claimed what would become the Louisiana Territory for France. Mm-hmm. Basically, what he did was he sailed down the entirety of the length of the Mississippi into the Gulf, and he claimed the entirety of Louisiana in the name of son Louis, otherwise known as King Louis IX. And he would he'd erect a column with the royal coat of arms on it, plant a cross, and bury a lead plate in the ground, kind of as a ceremony to claim all of Louisiana. There were other expeditions going on during this time as well, but I don't really know too much about them. Mm-hmm. And we've already really covered kind of the big expeditions. Gotcha. And a lot of them, at the end of the day, would report a lot of the same things. Usually about glowing reports of Missouri's, in particular, bountifulness and natural beauty. So they would be looking in the waters, and they'd see these giant catfish. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know how much you know about catfish, but
they're very big in the Mississippi.
Yeah, they can get up to 9 pounds. Yeah. The reason why noodling was banned in Missouri was because noodling is the practice of grabbing into a catfish burrow and yanking the catfish out by their gills. Mm-hmm. That was banned as a practice in Missouri because at those size ranges, right, 90 pounds and up, the catfish could easily break your arm and draw you into the burrow and drown you that way.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's around
fishing for real, man. Get in there and wrestle with that,
yeah.
You know?
Talk about taking your life in your hands on a fishing expedition, right? So
okay, next slide.
If you want to go next slide, please.
All right.
So these are the men involved. I have another picture of that same map as before because I really like it. The Marquette and Joliet expedition there is going to be the one in orange along the Mississippi River. Right. And that top picture there is Polyglot himself, Father Marquette. The bottom one is a drawing of Louis and Joliet.
Right. And by the way, there's a Pere Marquette State Park on the Illinois side, which is not far from, well, not that close, but relatively convenient to our home. We go there at least twice a year because in nearby Grafton, there's a flea market that my family loves to go to. So we go to the flea market in the spring and the fall, bare minimum, and always go to Pere Marquette State Park. So, and I'm sure Marquette's name is all over the other places too, but anyway, he's not forgotten.
I think there's a high school in St. Louis, a public high school.
That's
called
true.
Marquette High School.
That's right.
Yeah. I don't know if it has any relation, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Okay, next slide.
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah, and just on the map, a lot of lines there, just to give people a little guide. The Joliet, Marquette, orange, as you said. Also, that green line that goes all the way to the Gulf, that's La Salle in just a little bit after the Joliet Marquette expedition, right?
Yes,
So that
a couple
I
of years
guess
after.
is I guess that's when they really know for sure that this goes down instead of across or something like that, right?
Yes, that's
Yeah,
when they know for sure, and they
yeah,
figured they might as well get ahead of the English in claiming it.
right,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
they, they the
This period, by the way, is one of the reasons that I have my running joke about being Rex Lunae, King of the Moon, because this crazy thing where people come to some massive area, they don't, do anything to like necessarily to like establish a presence. They just, like you said, plant a little flag or something and say, "Hey, yeah, I'm the king of all of this, massive territory." It's sort of absurd, you know. Um, it's
yeah,
like, and that,
the
and
French also wanted to
in the same spirit,
yeah,
I have declared myself the king of the moon because why not,
exactly, yeah. The
Okay,
French too also wanted to confine the English to the coasts.
right,
They did
right,
not want them expanding any further than they were.
exactly. Okay, settling Missouri.
Yes, sir. So settling the Missouri, along the Mississippi Valley kind of went in two stages. So the French started first on the eastern side. I'm not entirely sure why. I think it's probably because they had established diplomatic relations with a lot of the Indians there. As I was saying, the Marquette and Joliet expedition would kind of talk with a lot of the Indians along the river, right, as they were
Mm-hmm.
going along. And I guess most of them were probably on the eastern side. So we would see first established in order Cahokia, and then Kaskaskia, which used to be the capital of Illinois, and then Fort de Chartres.
Mm-hmm.
Cahokia was named after a local tribe of Indians. The You might remember most prominently that there is a site in the area called the Cahokia Mounds.
Right.
That's the tribe that this town is named after. It is not necessarily associated with Cahokia Mounds, but
Right.
they figured might as well name it after the most prominent landmark, right?
Yeah.
So again, the
Oh yeah,
Cahokia was
and I'm
founded
sorry. I
by
should just mention for those who aren't local Seneca, the the mounds in general are interesting, and the large mound in particular. It's just a big, obviously at some point Earth made mound, um, but there's something about walking up long steps and getting to the top of it and looking out over St. Louis. If you get a chance, I really recommend it. It's just east of St. Louis. I don't know, 30 minutes or something, maybe less. I don't know. It
if that.
isn't hard to get to it if you're in the St. Louis area. Uh, it is really worth a visit if you're in the area. It points to a civilization that was there. I guess we don't know exactly when, but we guess we're pretty sure it was basically gone by the time of Columbus. Um,
Yeah,
I think that's about right. Uh,
I
But
think
anyway,
De Soto's expedition had actually gotten rumors of a high civilization in the area from the local Indian tribes, but
uh,
like you were saying,
so there might have been a
they
little bit of
were
overlap, but there wasn't an actual encounter that I've ever heard of Europeans
yes,
hanging out at the Cahokia Mounds with the Mississippian civilization. It wasn't that kind of overlap.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
No, it wasn't that kind of overlap. It was probably maybe 50 or 100 years removed or something like that.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so Cahokia would be founded by French priests from the Seminary of Foreign Missions, which is not the Jesuits. And these guys were, again, trying to evangelize the local Indian tribes.
Right.
The town itself is actually interesting because the French lived in one section of it and the Indians lived in the other.
Mm.
So it was actually segregated. It was it wasn't necessarily for racial reasons. The From what I understand of like how the French view everybody else is that the French don't care necessarily what race you are, so long as you're French. Like you adopt French culture and French ways because France clearly is the superior country.
Right.
So what they were trying to do is they were trying to like obviously convert the Indians to Catholicism, but they were also trying to get them into French culture.
Yeah.
Then after that, you would have Kaskaskia, also founded by Jesuit missionaries. This time, actual Jesuit missionaries, and similarly divided like Cahokia, right? But intermarriage was rife between the two
Mm.
sections.
Hmm.
And then finally, you would have Fort de Chartres in 1719. It was created by the provincial government that was there at the time to kind of oversee what would become the state of Illinois, but back then it
Hmm.
was more like Illinois Parish or Illinois County.
Hmm.
It was there to prevent against hostile Indian attacks, but the fort itself is actually still there. Um, you can actually go and visit it. The local historians there actually put on what's called a quote unquote rendezvous, like every quarter or so, where
Oh,
it's like
cool.
everybody gets dressed up in gear and they would like all the peddlers would sell their wares and stuff like that. I've been, it's really cool.
Yeah, yeah, and
Um,
again, if any of our listeners have never done such a thing, it's sort of like a historical reenactment. People will, this is the kind of thing where people try to kind of stay in character, right? They won't just be in
mhm,
costume. They'll actually be like, I don't know where you bring up a car and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about, right? That kind of thing. Um, if you've
kind of, yeah.
never experienced something like that, I actually really recommend it. It's more interesting than you might guess.
It's an American themed Renaissance fair.
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So the first actual settlement in Missouri, though, was Saint Genevieve in 1735.
Yeah.
It's the oldest permanent Missouri settlement. There's a couple of them before. So like there
Hmm.
was a settlement on the River des Peres in 1700, and then you have a fort that was stationed basically up the Missouri River to protect against Indian attack called Fort Orleans.
Hmm.
Um, the reason for the settlement of Saint Genevieve, though, was to kind of function as a port town, but also there were some very key resources there: salt springs and lead mines. The salt would be used as a preservative to make sure that meat wouldn't spoil while the French were exploring, up the Tennessee River or the Kentucky River, or even up the Missouri or the Mississippi. And then they would obviously be using like the lead for like ammunition and other things like that. The mines that were feeding Saint Genevieve were Mine la Motte, Fort Charenard, and Mine la Breton. I think with Mine la Breton being the oldest one out of the
Hmm.
three.
Yeah, and I guess this is the time to mention, courtesy of one of my sons, we're members of the St. Louis Mineral and Gem Society and have been for goodness 7 years now. And they often do field trips. And one of our field trips was to what's called Old Mines. It's an area called Old Mines,
Mm-hmm.
and it is literally these kinds of places. In fact, the one I have in mind right now was in St. Genevieve County. St. Genevieve itself, the town, wasn't far from where we were. In fact, my son and I went and had dinner there after we did the rock collecting. Um, we were collecting at an old mine site. Don't picture, the what is it? The where you've got a mine with a shaft and scaffolding to hold it all up, and you're going deep into the hill. No, no, no. This was like they started just digging down into the ground and just kept pulling stuff out and throwing it, tossing it out. And so you just have this big mound of stuff they'd tossed out while they were going down into the ground. Um, and one of the delights of that trip was that I got talking to the landowner who was allowing us to do this. Um, and he was the one that mentioned that his grandmother had spoken French to him. And I was like, oh, wow. So the French weren't gone. In fact, this guy knew one of them, is descended from one of
Yeah.
them and spoke to her. So,
Mm-hmm.
and he wasn't like an old man. He was younger than me, I think. Or I don't know, around my age, or I know, younger than me. So anyway, that blew my mind. That was cool. That was a really cool trip. Yes, and as I highlight in my piece on the Battle of St. Louis, which I'm going to make into a video for this channel. The lead mining in St. Genevieve ended up being really key to that battle because lead makes better bullets than other options they had at the time. So one of the contributions to the Battle of St. Louis, besides some men, was lead bullets from the lead mines in the St. Genevieve area, Saint Genevieve area.
Mm-hmm. So if we want to go to the next slide there, Brad.
Yep.
Yeah. So finally, we would get to the big town of St. Louis being founded in 1763. Pair of gentlemen named Auguste Chouteau and Pierre Laclede Leguest, I don't know, something along those lines. My faux Midwestern French accent will not allow me to pronounce that last name there.
Yeah.
Established the town of St. Louis. So
Yeah.
the purpose of St. Louis actually at the time was to be a trading port, very similar to St. Genevieve. The Auguste Chouteau and Laclede, as we will call him, were coming up from the town of New Orleans, and they were going to establish a trading post in the area. Originally, they were thinking about stopping in St. Genevieve, but tragedy struck because St. Genevieve wouldn't even hold a quarter of what they had brought. St. Genevieve was a tiny, tiny little town still. It didn't have the facilities. So Pierre Laclede and Chouteau sail up the river. They figure out that there's this very, very nice confluence of the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers, and they figure, yeah, it might as well, right? Be the jumping off point for any future explorations deeper into the interior of the United States.
Yeah.
And Leguest goes to Fort de Chartres, right? They come in like the middle, pretty close to the middle of winter. And he basically says goodbye to Chouteau and tells him to establish the trading post. Now, this is kind of insane because Chouteau at the time is 13.
Oh, what?
So Chouteau was an engineer's apprentice. And if you know anything about the trades, oftentimes if a particular apprentice was very, very skilled or had like some kind of like virtue made them a good leader or something like that, like the tradesmen at the time would allow them to go kind of on their own and do their own projects, and that's what Chouteau was doing. He was leading the construction of St. Louis as a trading post and would evolve into a city. Chouteau himself would actually settle in St. Louis and would stay and would become very politically powerful.
Right.
I think he was actually the mayor for
But he
quite a
started
while.
when he was 13. I had never heard that. That's insane.
Yes.
Wow.
He was about 13 when he started the construction of St. Louis.
And sorry,
so
let's be clear,
viewer, you are behind.
Let's be clear that at this point it's a village. It goes on to become a city later, but for some decades it's the village of St. Louis. It's quite small.
Yes.
As I know, because
yes.
the Battle of St. Louis was in the 17. I'm sorry, I should know. It was like 1779, something like that. It was in the middle of the secession over on the East Coast from Great Britain, and it was still a village at that time and quite small. So yeah, it took a while to get to what it is now.
Yeah, exactly. So Chouteau would not Chouteau. Laclede would come back from Fort de Chartres roughly about March or April or so after Chouteau was done constructing the trading post and a couple of houses for all the workers and stuff like that. And Laclede would christen St. Louis, the village of St. Louis, as St. Louis in honor of King Louis IX, who is a saint in the Catholic faith. Yeah. There'd be a couple of other cities founded during this time as well. St. Charles being one of them, and also Carondelet. St. Charles was started kind of as a trading post for the trading post by Louis Blanchette. And we'll get into it a little bit later, but during the French period, it would develop a pretty intense rivalry with St. Louis.
Right. And now St. Charles is kind of part of the St. Louis metro. It's part of the St. Louis metro area, but it does retain its own identity and its own fun things that happen there and stuff. We go there a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, next slide.
Yep.
All right.
So this is a kind of a map of all of those settlements that I just discussed, kind of
Yeah.
giving the viewer an idea of what the situation was roughly around about this time. You can see Fort Orleans there and another fort, Fort Canaveral, I think, all the way up there along the
Mm-hmm.
Missouri River, kind of, saving space and making sure that the area would be more or less secure, right? In case the
Right.
French wanted to explore a little bit more. So,
Yeah. Oh,
do
and
you want to go to the next?
I meant to mention about St. Louis. It is obviously key that it's at the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi. The confluence is actually north of St. Louis slightly, but um, I in fact live uh, pretty much at the confluence. Like
Oh, cool.
I can go look at it with a little hiking back
Do
into the
you
woods. Um, and
Question, random question.
Yeah,
Uh, can you see the Piazza bird from where you're at?
the Piazza bird. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. What is this? Spell that?
So the Piasa, roughly like that.
Piazza bird. Oh, you're talking about uh the cave with the yeah, no. That's on the Illinois side. That's uh the mural in present day Alton. Yeah, we pass it all the
Hmm.
time when we're going up to Pere Marquette. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
the
Yeah.
for your listeners, right? I mentioned that because the Piazza bird is this very esoteric painting that was recreated relatively recently as a mural on one of the rocks on the Illinois side of the river. It was there actually when Marquette and Joliet were going down the river. That was one of the first
Mm,
things they encountered once they hit the St. Louis area. And it's this
wow.
big painting of a thunderbird. If the viewer wants to go look it up, they were
Yeah, it's
really
like
kind of
it looks like
shocked by
a
this painting.
mythic creature like a griffin or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Oh, so
total sidetrack, but I
yep. What I was trying to get to is that the flag of St. Louis is in fact two rivers coming together and becoming one with a fleur de lis in the middle. So
Mhm.
that aspect of the being set at the confluence is central to what St. Louis has been all about from the beginning, and we still recognize it in our flag. Okay, next slide. Or did anything else on this
Yes,
map?
sir. I think we're good.
Okay.
So to dive a little bit into like French American, French Missourian culture and society a little bit, if I had to summarize it, I would just summarize it as very communal and very Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the French were very known for creating these very dense, very small villages
Mm-hmm.
along the rivers wherever they settled. And they were also known for like communally farming the land, right? This will be in contrast with what the English do later on. So what the French would do is they would zone out sections of the riverbed itself and of the floodlands to to parcel out to different farmers. And each farmer would get something like 3 to 5 acres of land or something like that to farm. And all the farmers would go out together and they'd farm the land together and talk and chat while they're farming. And they would come back in and they would like go to church or they'd go home and eat together and stuff like that. And I also say very Catholic too, because society was rather organized around the parishes in the area, right? So the old cathedral in St. Louis, it wasn't limestone back then. It would have been like a wood church, but like the parish was really the center of social and cultural life at this point in time.
Yeah, and probably
Um,
worth mentioning that the thumbnail of the video is the old cathedral in St. Louis. As you'd mentioned, probably not how the French built it, out of wood, but maybe closer to that original design than it looks today, because I don't know what the term is, but there's these vertical things sticking up all over it in this drawing of how the old cathedral
gargoyles,
looked way back then. I don't know.
yeah.
I thought gargoyles usually kind of went out rather than up, but anyway, um,
I
There's
don't know. Could be a
something
type.
like that on it, which is not on the old cathedral today. So maybe a little closer to what it would have looked like when the French made it.
Yeah. And going back to the very Catholic part, not only was the parish the center of social and cultural life, but also Protestants were like banned completely from the territory. The Englishmen were not allowed in Louisiana at all if they were Protestant. That's also very important to mention too that this also includes the Huguenots in France.
Mm-hmm.
The English have this habit of encouraging their religious dissidents to emigrate to colonies and get out of basically the British Isles. The French don't have that.
Mm.
Um, matter of fact, they tried to keep the Huguenots as close to home as possible to make
Mm.
sure that this massive tract of land that they had just acquired in North America didn't suddenly I don't know, decide to secede and join the
Mm-hmm.
English colonies.
Right.
Um, so I can't help but think that maybe that's probably the reason why, as we'll see later, the French America didn't grow nearly as much. But to go back to the parish again,
Mm-hmm.
the since the parish was the center of social life as well, you would often see like dances and festivals and other activities as well organized out of the parish. It wasn't uncommon for the French to get all dressed up in their finery from France, and they would like spend the entire night on Sunday like drinking and dancing and feasting. They'd have tons of cotillions for all the young men and women to get together and learn their manners, but also to meet and to date and court each other and eventually to get married. Um, all of these churches would also start off as wood too. To kind of mention the construction of them, they would what the French would do instead of doing kind of the horizontal iconic log cabin style that we associate most with frontier life. What they would do is they would do vertical posts. They'd sink a post into the ground and they would build up the rest of the church or the structure around it. Um, there's actually a church nowadays that still exists in that old French log cabin style. It's actually one of the oldest active parishes in the United States. It's called the Church of the Holy Family, and I do have a picture on it in one of the next slides.
Yeah. Oh,
So,
real quick on the dancing, just wanted to mention that one of the things I did when I was late teen, I guess, early 20s, we were involved with a contra dancing group, which is, likes to carry forward the tradition of French dance. Um, and it's a called dance. If you've ever seen or done square dancing, it's sort of like that
mm,
style where they tell you, swing your partner around that kind of stuff. Except instead of a square, it's a line. There's two lines of people, and then you're moving up and down the line as you go through the moves that are called. Um, so
right,
anyway,
and the
little
the
echoes,
the
little
boys and the
echoes.
ladies would, yeah, like in those line dances, they would kind of be used for courtship as well, if I
Yeah,
remember
yeah,
correctly.
yeah.
Like the ladies would form one line, the men would form the other, and they would
Right.
dance and partner off and meet each other and you'd talk basically.
Yep. Good, clean fun.
So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you covered some of this
Yes.
already, the voyageurs, and I'm not going to try to say that. And then, did you mention Creoles yet? Not everybody knows what a Creole is.
Creoles, no. So a Creole is the definition has kind of changed over time, but
Mm.
during this particular period, basically a Creole was somebody who was born in New Orleans and was kind of born in North America, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
There was
Not from the old
you
world.
see not from the old world.
Yeah. Yeah.
You see a lot of mixing as well among like the Native Americans, the Creoles, and then also the black slaves later on as well,
Right.
which would contribute to this very, very Louisiana culture, state of Louisiana culture that we associate today.
Yep.
There's a presence of Creole culture in St. Louis and Old St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
that a lot of Creoles would end up migrating up to St. Louis from New Orleans to find economic opportunity on the frontier.
Mhm.
Um, so they would bring like all of their foodways and culture as well with them. So jambalaya, catfish, fried catfish was very popular as well, as far as I know.
Mhm.
All the stews and chilies and everything. Um, Speaking of which, folkways and food and dress, a lot of it was imported directly from France.
Yeah.
The French, like I said, cultural supremacists. They love everybody being French, and they don't necessarily mind what race you are, so long as you act French.
Right.
So for the dances in particular, right, the French would bring out their finest clothes and finery from like the latest in Parisian culture to
Mhm.
show off to everybody in the dance, saying, "Oh, look at me! I am worthy material. I
Yeah.
am a I am a member. I am a high standing member of society." But when they were dressing down, right, if they were going to work, they would often wear very simpler things like
Oh
blue
wait,
dresses and
should I
stuff
be
like that was
jumping?
very.
Should I be jumping to the pictures here?
Yeah, if you want to jump to pictures,
Seems
it'd be
like
great.
you're segueing to talking about how they dress. So here they are. Yeah.
Yeah, so the French had a fascination with blue. The women were often wearing like blue dresses and skirts and petticoats, and the men would often wear like blue, dye blued like breeches and stuff like that when they're working.
Mhm.
A lot of the stuff they'd be wearing would be buckskin, like replacements for things they necessarily can't get handily in the ports, like when they were trading with anybody who came up the river or down the river from France, right? Um, and then, as you can see, kind of on the bottom there, like Parisian dress was very, very in vogue during that particular time period. Everybody wanted to
Right.
emulate what was going on in Paris, the height of culture in Europe.
Right.
So the men would often be wearing like again like blue coats and officers wear. The women would often be wearing the stereotypical 3 or 4 petticoats with a skirt and have all these kinds of assortments of like fans and necklaces and um, calico slippers and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Back when
If
people
you want
knew
to go
how
to
to
the next
dress.
slide.
Okay. Next one.
Exactly. So here's a couple of the pictures of the building, right? If you look on the right-hand side, the church that is displayed there is the Church of the Holy Family, the oldest operating Catholic church parish in the United States.
So this is the
And you can really,
external on top and internal shot of the same church, right?
yes.
Cool. Very
So
neat. Where, I'm sorry,
you
where
can
is
really
that?
see the that's in Illinois.
Illinois. Okay.
I don't know exactly where. I think it
Hmm.
might be in Cahokia. I
I'll
don't
look it
remember
up. Go ahead.
exactly though. Yeah. So you can really see the vertical log cabin style that the French really, really liked in this particular picture. And like they would have the posts in and they would wattle and daub in the middle of it, I'm pretty sure. I don't know exactly the specifics of it, but houses were often constructed like that too. Typically, the French liked having these large wraparound porches to have social events, right? Um,
Yeah.
the more affluent and well-to-do. So Auguste Chouteau himself would oftentimes have limestone quarried to make their houses, but they would often have like these same central features of what we would associate with Southern architecture and with like Creole and Louisiana architecture as well. So high ceilings, wraparound porches, roomy porches.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Couple
and
comments.
then
The church on the right is Cahokia Holy Family Catholic Church. It is indeed in Cahokia, Illinois. I didn't know that. Thank you. We go to Cahokia now and again, so that'd be something to drive by.
they
Um,
yeah
and then
they
go ahead.
so the I just want to note real quick, the Church of the Holy Family over there in Cahokia actually does a Latin Mass, and
Oh wow.
they have several really cool artifacts. So the church was actually gifted um, they were gifted utensils and ware for mass directly by I want to say King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself.
Mm,
And
wow.
they still use those utensils and stuff like that. And one
Wow.
of the chalices that they have was used by Pope John Paul II himself.
Mm,
Now, that maybe that doesn't ring to why that's important if you're a Protestant, but for Catholics, we believe in relics.
hmm.
And there's an order of them. A first class relic is usually, directly the body of a saint.
Right.
A second class relic is anything a saint touches.
Hmm.
And a third class relic is anything that touches a second class relic. So that chalice, because Pope John Paul II is also considered a saint, is a second class relic.
Got it. So more
So
notes on that
there's
church, and then I wanted to comment on the house in the middle top. It says on their website, oldest Catholic church west of the Alleghenies, established in 1699. All right. Now,
Mhm.
that building in the top middle, is very familiar looking. There's a number of houses that are still there that the French built way back in St. Genevieve. And in fact, my
Yep.
wife's professor owned one of them, and my wife would be
Oh,
at
did
like
she?
events at them. Anyway, they're extremely cool, and some of them they will do tours during some of the jour de fête and stuff like that. You'll get to go inside some of these historic French homes, and yeah, they are quite strikingly. They have a certain look to them, with the porches and in some cases the vertical beams and everything. But yeah, what are the what do we have on the left here?
So on the left is the old cathedral itself.
Ah,
The
got it.
current iteration of it is about the fourth one, I believe.
Hmm.
And it is the one that was made out of limestone. I think it was established in 1834. It's not exactly like during the heyday of French America, but
Right.
like it's definitely one of the oldest continually used sites, I believe. And I don't think it's moved from where it was originally established back in 1764 when St. Louis was established. I think they're still using the original site, if I remember correctly.
Oh yeah, no, I think it's where it was, if I remember correctly. Yeah, the old cathedral is something that everyone knows here in St. Louis. I think we were taught about it in school or something, but it's very well known. Yeah. Okay. Anything else
Yes,
on this
if
page,
you
or we'll
have a
move on?
chance and you're passing,
Yeah, yeah, visit it.
just
Absolutely.
a quick comment.
Yeah.
Yeah, visit it definitely, but that's what I've got.
Okay. All right. Next.
So, politics, economy, and Indian relations.
Yeah.
The territory was ruled by a governor in New Orleans, so his seat was there. But in kind of assisting the governor in ruling the territory, there were five what's called commandants, which ruled five different quote unquote departments. We could call them states as well. I think the setup was like Illinois, Louisiana, the Great Lakes region, so all of what's French Canada, and then also Arkansas as well. The Both the commandant and the governor had rather broad powers. Both of them were appointed by the king, and they were both expected to lead the army and well, I guess you could say the militia rather than the army. They were both expected to lead the militia into combat, and then also they were supposed to be legislating, and then also adjudicating on behalf of the people, right? So if there were petitions that people wanted to bring, they'd bring them to the commandant or the governor. If they wanted death certificates, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and stuff like that, all of it had to be signed by either the governor or the commandants. Um, Part of me thinks that the reason why it's set up this way, having very similar powers and overlapping gray areas, is actually because of what was going on in France. Because this is not a very efficient system. The there could be all kinds of like power plays and stuff like that going on between the governor and the commandants. And I think the reason why this was occurring, why the French crown set it up like this, was probably because of the influence of absolutism. The king wanted to be the ultimate authority to adjudicate on matters, and having dueling commandants and governors made sure that any adjudications weren't being solved by one party or the other. Keeps them from being too powerful. Checks and balances.
Yeah.
So all of politics were basically funneled through these 5 or 6 men. And they were basically kind of ruling their own fiefs, more or less. So not very democratic, and ultimately not too much to say there. But kind of moving on to the economy, though, there were 3 big resources that the French were exporting. Basically, they were mining, or mining, hunting, anything like that. So furs, salt, and lead. And a lot of this was to help trade with the Indians. So the French would use the resources they had at hand, the salt, the lead, and the furs, to purchase goods from France. And then they would use those goods from France to trade ultimately with the Indians, because the Indians really loved European goods. They were addicted to European goods by the end, because simply put, like, the European stuff was just superior. So any tools that the Indians could have made out of bone and stone just didn't compare to, like, spring steel. So, or like just wrought iron in general. The Indians would really love their cooking pots by the end of trade with the Europeans. Knives, it's completely superior. Also, they loved the muskets as well. And the French would take advantage of the Indians in this particular way. So, like I was saying before at the very beginning of this stream, the French would try their hardest to make sure that the Indians stayed on side, right? Stayed friendly with the French, because ultimately the Indians were their trade partners. So the French were very heavy-handed with any kinds of crimes that maybe the colonists had committed against the Indians, for example. And then the French government would often even sometimes let the occasional Indian crime go completely unpunished.
Mm-hmm.
Bribery of the Indians was very common. It's more so than just simply giving them goods for almost nothing. A very common French practice during this time was actually to gift an Indian chief that they wanted to keep on side with a medallion. On one side would be face of the commandant or the governor at the time, or even the French king. And on the other would be some other kind of symbol. I don't know what it was, but the important bit was the face on the front end of it. And it was, to the Indians, that was basically like giving your heart, like giving your loyalty to the French or whoever was in charge of that particular province or area. And it was often noted by previous governors who were training up their replacements, basically, that you never ever 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 give an Indian chief with a medallion with more than 2 faces on it. You only just want to give them one, because the Indians would always reject the gift, and they would say, I can't give my heart to more than one person, basically. So,
okay,
a little bit of kind of, yeah.
Next slide.
Yeah.
Now we get to sort of the end of the story, so to speak.
Yeah. So there was some turnover previously with administrations between the French, right? So you obviously had different French governors, but you also had Spanish governors as well. And there wasn't much change between the French and Spanish governments.
Yeah, so that Battle of St. Louis I wrote about, the Spanish were that was the period where the Spanish were in charge of the territory or whatever. And so there's a Spanish commander who commands the people fighting against the English and Indians who are who are attacking St. Louis. And by the way, Cahokia was simultaneously attacked, but both were defended successfully. But the people fighting, except for like the commander, basically everybody fighting were just French militia, just private French people who knew how to use a gun. and and of course the St. Genevieve guys who brought up the lead bullets along with some fighting force. So yes, I gathered from learning about that story that the Spanish were kind of nominally in charge, but it wasn't like they were sweeping through and replacing French culture or the French people during that period.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
The in a lot of ways, France, like St. Louis and all of these colonies along the Mississippi River, were just far too remote for the Spanish to really deal with.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like their governors would try to change policy, right? So the French obviously love their food. Every single peasant woman like loved to cook and everything, and they were very well educated. But because there was just such abundance in Missouri, the French never really got past subsistence farming phase. They were never really exporting crop, and that
Mm-hmm.
would bug the Spanish to no end. They would try to change policy. They would try to get the French in Missouri and along the colonies to actually like, hey, like do more than subsistence farming.
Mm-hmm.
But the French were just like, nah, we'll just hunt in the woods. We don't care. And they quit trying after a while, but that would
Mm-hmm.
also like bug the Spanish to no end. But kind of to go back, the French also didn't really care that they were under Spanish rule. Obviously, they prefer to be ruled by the French,
Right.
because again, culture snobs. But they didn't really mind because the Spanish ultimately didn't have too much control over them, and it's a Catholic nation. Why not? But that would change with the coming of the English. The the English weren't really allowed, like I said, in Louisiana before this. There was a slight change, right, in 1795, where Protestants were allowed in by the Spanish government, but they had a single generation to convert. They were supposed to immediately basically become Catholics, and contribute to the population that way. That ban was gone with U.S.
Mm-hmm.
control after it was purchased in 1804. The With that comes the endless flood of Americans. So typically like Scots Irish, basically.
Mm-hmm.
These people were out looking for territory of their own, something to put a place to call their home, and there were tons of people crossing the river. I've seen numbers that like suggest about 500 a day crossing the Mississippi,
Wow.
but it's possible that it was like as high as 1,000 a day at its
Wow.
height. Um, because Missouri blows up as a territory during this particular time.
Right.
There's going to be some census data later down the line that'll be rather revealing that goes um, right up to when the United States admits Missouri. Well, right as the United States buys Missouri
Mm-hmm.
off of the French,
The Louisiana
but
Territory. Yeah.
like yeah, it'll be revealing. But to kind of go back to the culture clashes, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were obviously intractable differences between the English and the French because they were different religions, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the French were very communal and very Catholic, whereas the English and the Americans were more, they're predominantly, I think, Methodist and Baptist during this time.
Hmm.
And there were radical differences in how they structured their communities. Where the French preferred to be, in large towns, basically, along rivers. The English wanted to be way into the interior,
Hmm.
on their own private plots of land, and among a community of no more than a couple thousand. The Scots Irish, in particular, eschewed cities. They did not like them at all.
Hmm.
Breeding grounds for sin, I think, in their opinion. And with the coming of the
It's interesting.
English, I mean, French culture in the area is just completely swamped out.
Right.
They kept it at bay for a little bit because there was some migration going on around about the time of the Louisiana Purchase from New France, the Canadian colonies, and then also from New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
But that very stops, and the French quit coming, and with that, just like the English, just flood out French culture. I put it at 1806 because that's when I remember the signs in St. Louis being changed over from the French signs that were there originally to the new English signs,
Mm.
which it seems like a little thing, but I think that's really telling about how much
Yeah.
St. Louis changed in a very, very small amount of time.
Yeah. Though
And
very,
with that,
very,
we have
though there's very, very many names of towns, schools, streets, etc., that are still French to this day. So it
yeah,
didn't
they were
all, the
very
names
quickly
didn't go away.
anglicized.
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
I wanted to make a comment, which is that when you talk about the very different style of the English settler from the French settler, it makes me think of like Daniel Boone would be maybe, poster child for this style, right? Where he says, I don't want to see the smoke from my neighbor's cabin. that that
basically.
they're getting too close. Um, and again,
Daniel Boone would.
something in the area that I'd really recommend is the Daniel Boone home. There's a number of Daniel Boone homes. This is a home he was in when he died, so near the end of his life is actually his son's home, really. But it's pretty cool, actually. It's a pretty cool site, and a local university, Lindenwood University, that my wife attended. Um, they bought the Daniel Boone home and then started moving other historic buildings so that you basically have a sort of artificial village. There wasn't a village there. It was literally just the Daniel Boone home. But they brought a bunch of other buildings to be in sort of the valley below the home. So you get to see the Daniel Boone home itself and get a tour and learn about Daniel Boone's funny habit, which I won't mention to not spoil it. Encourage you to go there. But then you get to go through all these other. There's a nice sort of frontier church and so on and so forth. Cool historic buildings that they basically took apart and reconstructed at the site. So great place to visit. Highly recommended.
Yeah,
Okay, ready to
and
go to Pawpaw French here?
yep, that's what I was just about to mention.
Yeah.
The French, and you can really tell just how many Englishmen were coming over the Mississippi River just by the development of what's called Pawpaw French. I don't even know if it's actually recognized as a dialect of French, considering how English it sounds.
Hmm.
Um, for those who don't know in the audience, the French have a very strict system of categorizing what is and isn't French through
Yeah.
what's called the Académie Française.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones who are like the governing body of the French language. I don't know if it would actually qualify because you can see in the chart here, right? The the French during this time period basically ripped whole idiomatic phrases and cognates from English, uh, based off of a phonetic spelling. I'm pretty sure. So if you see on
Mm-hmm.
the left hand side, right? Let's go for the first one. Voiture. That's the French word for car, automobile. The Pawpaw French is roughly pronounced char,
Mm-hmm.
car.
Right.
Same thing with potato, right? In the French, it's pronounced pomme de terre, apple of the earth, is the literal translation. The
Yeah.
Pawpaw French, it's patate.
Right.
Insect, for example, insecte, something along those lines in the French. Pawpaw French, it sounds like beetle, beetle.
Mm-hmm.
So insect, bug. The only real, I won't say the only real thing the Pawpaw French kept during this time of mass immigration was the word for ball, boule. But it's already very similar to what the English had already. If you don't know the history of the English language, I would suggest you, like the audience, go and research it because like there was already a ton of cognates in English from the time of the Norman invasion. The English is a very sedimentary language because of that. You have layers in history that you can see in the language already,
Yep.
just based off of tracking vocabulary and cognates from other languages. And French is already a third of the English language, anglicized
Hmm.
versions of the French vocabulary, obviously. But
Right.
with with Pawpaw French then taking so much from English, I wonder if proper, quote unquote, proper French, as they would say, the proper, true French would wonder if this was kind of an incestuous, bastardized dialect of French.
Right.
And then,
Now you were going to mention that there's almost no speakers left of Pawpaw French, this dialect. Um, but
oh yeah, this is basically a dead dialect.
right. But I wanted to mention that I just in anticipation of the show, I mentioned it to somebody who has an interest in French, local French dialects and so forth. He's been learning Cajun French, I think, um, because of his interest in that style of music. He ended up just starting to learn the language. Um, and anyway, he told me that there is actually a guy doing a class in Pawpaw French, trying to keep it going. So
Yeah, exactly.
someone's trying.
There, since about 2015, there's been many attempts, I think, by both the state of Illinois and the state of Missouri to make sure that Pawpaw French does not die out,
Yeah,
because it is an integral part of the history.
right.
And
But
as we'll see why in a
there's
couple
it's
of
just not
minutes.
an ongoing. You don't have a a community that's all speaking it. It's just
Yeah,
isolated aging people
th-
at this point, basically. So it's a
th-
losing
this is
battle, I'm
based.
afraid.
Yeah, this is artificially kept alive by the education system. As
Right.
you can see by the graphic over there on the right hand side, that's all the areas where Pawpaw French is spoken. It's
Hmm.
mostly spoken in those two very blue rectangles right there. So the top one is Jeffco, Jefferson County.
Hmm.
The kind of the bottom one, most western one is Washington County. And
Hmm.
then St. Genevieve is right there, the less bluish one. I
Yeah.
don't know what the counties are in Indiana and then
Illinois.
Illinois.
That's a. Or, oh
Uh,
yeah, there's one in Indiana that surprised me, and then there's the ones right across the
yeah, that's
Mississippi. There. Yeah.
yeah. So like it's this dialect is more or less kept alive only by the efforts of the academy.
Hmm. Okay. Next slide.
Yeah.
All right.
So the like I was saying before, that repeal of the strict ethnic religious ban when the United States acquired Louisiana was more or less the death knell of French Missouri. From here, it's constant demographic decline. The the urban French in St. Louis, St. Genevieve, and St. Charles and other areas would very, very quickly assimilate into the
Hmm.
new English majority, more or less, within a couple of generations.
Right.
So French culture was pushed very steadily out into the rural areas. So at the
Hmm.
time, Jefferson County, and then Washington County, areas around the Tomahawk Mountains, which were the main sources of like the salt mines and also the lead mines as well. The dialect of Pawpaw French very quickly became associated with poverty and with backwardsness. These isolated French communities were more or less on life support because of those mining industries that were there. All of that went under in the Depression. Um, During the panic, right, and during the subsequent economic collapse of the United States during the Great Depression, the mines and mine owners basically all pulled out. They said, "We're
Hmm.
done, and we're going to be abandoning all of these mines." So the French communities there were left more or less without an income.
Right.
And it doesn't help either that the English who were in charge of the education system later made it more or less kind of a de facto teaching that French in Missouri was pretty associated with kind of being culturally inferior. The it was very heavily coded towards leaning like making sure that the French were coded as like low class during teaching and stuff like that. The After all of this was done with, and after they had done away with the official policy of making sure that French was kind of coded as low class, the couple of local Missouri historians came out in 1976 to Jefferson County, Washington County, St. Genevieve, the Tomsauk Mountains areas, and did a survey on how many French speakers were left. And
Mm,
by this point in time, there were only about 1,000.
mm,
Um, they redid the survey and were desperately trying to record all of the information they could up until 2014 when they redid the survey. And by that point, there were only about 30 native speakers of Pawpaw French left.
yeah.
So this is all very indicative of just how fast the French went from being the dominant political force in Missouri and being the dominant cultural force to being completely ostracized, even by by the 1870s, 1880s.
Hmm.
Um, Even by that point, the French didn't really have much of an influence over the happenings of Missouri politics anymore.
Right. Um, oh, what was I going to say? Oh, well, two things. One, speaking of mines, the Bonne Terre mine, really recommend that.
Mm-hmm.
It was once the world's largest producer of lead ore, but it flooded, and which happens to mines if you don't pump them out. They just fill up with water. And so it is now a billion gallon underwater lake, which you
Oh,
can
that's
do
cool.
a little boat tour of. I thought it was fascinating. You're looking down in this extremely clear, cold water and seeing mining equipment they left behind. Um, that in some cases is 100 feet or more below you because there were levels and levels down into the ground. Um, and then they now use it a lot for scuba diving. They teach scuba diving and do scuba diving in the lake. So it's a popular scuba diving place. But just to go there and do the tour, great activity. It's a hour south of St. Louis, something like that. So really recommended. And then in regards to the decline of the French, I was sort of, I had sort of had this vague idea that when the Louisiana Purchase happened or something, there must have been something I forgot to hear about, or that, if nobody informed me of, where the French were driven out, or there was a war, or a slaughter, or something like that. And as I mentioned about this fellow that I got to know whose grandmother had spoken French to him, that's not true at all. What the story you've told is actually the right one, which is not that there was this sudden exodus or suppression or something like that. They just were overwhelmed with English settlers, and so the culture was no longer dominant and kind of has been petering out and it's almost gone at this point. Um, this sounds very much like the concern that we've been discussing on this channel from Renaud Camus when he talks about the Great Replacement. Um, what he means by that, when you learn more about it, is not that necessarily the original population is wiped out, but just that they're overwhelmed and their culture starts to be lost because they're overwhelmed by some imported culture. So whatever you think of what happened here, it seems to me it's a good historical example of what Camus is talking about and what he fears is happening throughout the Europe and other places as mass immigration comes in and overwhelms the original culture in England and in France and so on and so forth. Well, here it happened right here in my state to the French as the English came in
Exactly.
and people just stop speaking French and the culture gets lost, the ways get lost, the dancing gets lost, etc., right?
Exactly. Yeah. It, it's very hard at times, especially in a period of mass migration, to keep your own culture alive.
Yeah.
There's just so many people coming in and so many new ideas. Oftentimes, it, it's it's just hard, I guess. And it's a story that we've seen before, right? This is the tale of the destruction of so many different empires, right? This was the tale of Rome with the immigration of the Goths and the Germans. This was the tale of Judah and Israel, actually. Um, I don't know if it's often covered in your church, Radlib, but Like, I was shocked when I learned that the reason why the Jews looked down upon the Samaritans is because they saw the Samaritans as fake Jews. The Samaritans were basically transplants put there by the Babylonian Empire. Um, they were trying to LARP as Jews. They had adopted Jewish folkways, but they had bastardized the local, the actual Jewish religious ways by worshiping all of these pagan gods. It's
Yeah.
it's a tale as old as time.
Yep.
Nihil nove sole. There's nothing new under the sun, as the scriptures say.
Yeah. What happens with Samaria is very much like the Great Replacement. It was an imperial policy to move these other people in for the purpose of diluting the local culture, which was successful to a great degree, right? So much so that
Mhm.
the tribe of Judah that was left over, that was more sort of pure Jewish, ended up just viewing them as, not just foreigners, but sort of despicable or something, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to get to this last slide because this is, to me, sort of the shocking revelation of all this. And just to give the context of why I find this so shocking is because, like I said, everywhere I go, it seems, I run into the legacy of the French in this area. And I've ranged quite a bit, especially because the St. Louis Mineral and Gem Society. I've kind of gotten around a bit, north of St. Louis, south of here, into the old mines area, and so on and so forth. And so I've kind of been ranging around the last 5 to 7 years, and in this area, and I just keep on running into the legacy of the French. And yet, let's go to this final slide. How many French were there in the Louisiana Territory, Seneca?
Not very many. So, like, this is part of the reason why the French were completely swamped out. There just weren't enough of them to maintain a lively culture, even as kind of a minority. The it's very difficult to get to St. Louis from mainland France, for example, right? You either have to go down the St. Lawrence River into the Great Lakes, and then down the Fox or the Wisconsin into the Mississippi, and then to St. Louis. Or you either have to go through New Orleans, and you have to paddle up the whole way from New Orleans to St. Louis, both of which are arduous journeys, no matter how you want to slice it. Um, I think probably pretty frequently they went maybe the St. Lawrence route because it was just easier to do downstream rather than upstream. But no matter which way you're slicing it, you're looking at, months of time spent on a boat or in a canoe. And it's just incredibly hard to get people to come here. Like
Yeah.
there was a program that the French king actually set up where he would take women of good standing in society, right, who were single, give them dowries, like directly from the French crown, and tell them to go basically find a husband in St. Louis or
Mm-hmm.
in one of these outlying French communities just to get the population up, or
Yeah.
try to at least. I
Right.
think some 800, 900, maybe even 1,000 women took those dowries and went to the New World.
Mm.
Um, Even then, it's like they could, by the end of it, by the time the territory switched over to U.S. control, there was only about 10,000 people total in Louisiana, the whole of Louisiana.
Right. Including
This is
right.
including
So
slaves.
they give us counts for New Madrid, Saint Genevieve, St. Louis, St. Charles, and then later they add in Cape Girardeau. And so they give us counts for 1796, 1799, 1800, 1804. 1796, I'll skip the middle stages. 1796, you've got about 2,810, European French. By 1804, right before the Louisiana Purchase, you only have about 9,000. So when 500 to 1,000 English people start coming over the river every day, and yeah, those communities of a few thousand each in St. Louis and St. Charles and so forth, they're not going to be able to keep their dominant French culture, or the French culture is not going to stay dominant. It just ain't going to happen.
No,
Yeah.
no. To put it even into further context, if I remember correctly, one of the requirements for territorialhood and then statehood is a population count. So to be a territory, you need about 25,000 people. To be a
Mm,
state, you need about 60,000.
mm.
Um, the Missouri, I think, had applied for territorial status with the United States by 1810 or so.
Oh, wow.
We're at 25,000, about there, right
Oh
there.
my goodness. So
We
already
had
the French are
reached,
outnumbered within 15 years or whatever.
well, that's within like 7 or 8.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Within 15 years, the like when the state was founded in 1820, which was delayed actually. There were Look up the Talmadge Amendment. We could have been a state in 1819, but
Yeah,
we
there's
became a state in
The
1820.
Missouri Compromise. It got complicated politically. So it's 1821.
Yes.
June 1821 is when um, Congress grants Missouri statehood. But yeah, it was delayed because of complicated political issues, and it had enough people before that. So in about 15 years, the French are a smaller minority within the area, right? Within the state of what becomes the state of Missouri. So wow,
Yeah, because
that's
the
fast,
state of like, in order to become a state, that population requirement is 60,000.
right?
Missouri had 66 and a half when we applied.
Mm-hmm.
So just the amount of English immigration just dwarfs the number
Yeah,
of French that were coming in.
right. Okay, excellent. I thought that those numbers blew my mind because they left such a strong legacy in my area, and there just weren't that many of them. But they were here first, so they got to name a lot of things. I guess that's part of it. Um,
Yes.
very
Monuments
quickly,
written in stone.
you drew a lot on the Missouri Historical Society. I have a friend who works at the location here in St. Louis, um, and just wanted to shout out to them. And you praised the amazing information you were able to get a hold of by digging back through their newsletters, right?
Yeah, so the Missouri State Historical Archives, they have every single issue of the Missouri Historical Review, which is the kind of the academic paper
Mm-hmm.
of note for history here in Missouri. And their archive stretches all the way back to their founding, or at least when they started writing the Missouri Historical Review in like 1910 or something like that. They've got everything. It's a great resource if you're looking through and trying to find Missouri specific history and what was
Yeah.
going on in the state.
Okay.
The top source that I have right there, Dwayne
Right.
Meyer, actually draws on it heavily as well.
Right. Okay. I am going to switch the slides off and hit a few comments people made. Let's see here that I thought were interesting. Oh, and I should always check first Subscribe Star to see if anybody chatted over there. Okay, nope. All right, so then I want to highlight a few things that I thought were interesting. Earlier on, when we were talking about Latin American settlement, Daniel Hall said that Latin American settlement was usually by second or third sons of lower nobility or men without ties in Iberia.
Mhm.
So that's interesting. Oh, and I get the general pattern. I wouldn't say don't cite me here, but I get the general feeling that the English settlers that we look back to in Plymouth and so forth came with families, where it seems like the French and the Spanish tended to send men. So there was a lot more mixing with the population, the Amerindians, because they were the only women around a lot of the times, or they just really didn't form families. They came, they had their little adventure, and then they went back to the home country. That's sort of the general pattern, with exceptions, obviously, that we've been discussing, because there were some French settlements. But just doesn't seem like they sent the families in the huge amounts that the British Isles did.
Right.
Let's see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you mind if I comment on that real quick?
Oh no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. So justification, your idea definitely would hold up. For the French and the Spanish, it seems that the enterprise of colonization was just that. It was about money at the end of the
Mm-hmm.
day. They wanted to extract resources, preferably gold and silver, but if they couldn't do that, sugar, furs, whatever they could get their hands on, and turn that into gold and silver so they can fuel their European enterprises, their various different wars that they were waging, whether that be internally or externally.
Yeah.
The English colonization was more it was more associated with purging religious dissidents.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas the French would oftentimes go as single men to seek their fortune in the wilderness, whether it be hunting furs or looking for gold or something like that. The English would often come with their whole families because they had nowhere else to go, or they
Mm-hmm.
wanted to find freedom in the North American continent,
Right.
away from the oppression of the Church of England
Yeah,
or
yeah.
from the oppression of the king and Parliament.
Right. Okay, Daniel Hall again. A Quebecer once told me that the French had to basically uh, give free passage and bribe to coerce women who were either arrested for prostitution or petty crime to go to Canada and stay so that there'd be some women for the men.
Yeah, it basically happened with St. Louis and the French settlements down here on the Mississippi River too. Like I said, there
Okay,
was a whole program set up by the king to make sure that there were somewhat eligible women to
right.
form families with in the colonies because just women weren't going. Why would you?
Yep, yep. Um, Overseer says, look up old paintings by American masters. You can see the awesomeness of the old American wilderness. And he comments back on the bride thing. The story of North America's colonization involved a hilarious amount of mail order brides on all sides. I've seen
Yes.
some of the ads that men would put. Some of them are pretty awesome. It's like, I've got a farm. I'm a good guy. Come, something like that.
Mhm.
Uh, let's see. Oh, Daniel Hall says, replying, it's been speculated that this is the secret sauce for the Americas producing so many attractive women because of the mail order brides. Anyway, I don't know. Let's see. Vinny Wedge says, I'm a French immigrant slash settler in the USA since 2014. MAGA.
Nice.
MAGA slash MAFA. I guess
Congratulations.
MAFA
Welcome to the
means
continent.
make America French again. Or wait,
Yep.
yeah. Oh, maybe that. Okay, okay. Um, let's see. Yeah, Space Squatch says Cahokia is roughly 17th century. That late. Okay, yeah. I don't know. I don't know if anyone really knows. We just kind of guess from various clues when the Cahokia Mound, the Mississippian civilization there was at its height, and there were a lot of people actually living on those mounds, or those. I should say the mounds were probably the priestly ruler center of communities. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
There's
There's a
swastikas.
lot of conflict on that question.
Yeah.
Like,
Space Squatch also says there's swastika symbolism on the main mound. I had forgotten that. I'll have to look for that. A good example of how endemic that sort of astrological symbolism is. Um, okay, let's see. Yeah, Irontown and Iron County are not too far from like Saint Genevieve. That's true. I've been in Iron County because of the iron. Uh,
yep.
let's see.
Also, a
I
very,
mentioned the
I think
scuba
that's the
diving and the
poorest
abandoned
county in
mine. I already
Missouri.
talked about that. Say it again.
Yeah. Iron County, I think, also holds up as you know, kind of a sort of last bastion of kind of French culture,
Oh,
in my
okay.
opinion, too. So,
Okay.
yeah, it's one
Daniel
of those. It's less diluted, but it's the same area.
Daniel Hall
One of
has
the
a good
poorest too in
question.
Missouri.
Was St. Charles named after St. Charles Borromeo? I should know this, and I don't.
I
Do you know?
don't know.
Okay, maybe you can look
I
that up while
don't.
I keep going. Um,
Maybe.
let's see. Okay, the Piazza bird is an interesting topic, says Space Squatch. It's a depiction of a spirit usually termed the aquatic panther. The wings are actually an anachronistic later addition, the aquatic panther being a river or lake spirit. It says overseers says they had averages of 7 to 14 kids from a couple in the French areas. Slightly lower fertility for the English colonizers of the time. They just had the giant ram of eating more immigrants in. Yeah. Let's see.
I've
Overseers.
looked it up too.
Oh, you got it?
Um, so it appears that the first church built in St. Charles in 1791 was actually named after the Italian saint Charles Borromeo.
There
So
you
maybe
go.
that's where it comes from.
Maybe that's where it is. Okay. Overseer says there's one of the biggest concentrations of relics in the world in St. Louis. There are like 14
Yep.
in one of the churches downtown, including a piece of the cross.
Yeah, piece of the true cross. The St. Louis is often nicknamed as the Rome of the West because the very dense Catholic population. I think about a
Yep.
third of St. Louis is Catholic.
Yes. Space Squatch says it should be mentioned for the Outlanders that the old cathedral is more or less at the foot of the Gateway Arch. Yes. One of the pictures I found when I was looking for something to use as the thumbnail is the old cathedral with everything around it demolished. It's just standing there looking very lonely. And the bottom of the arch, you see part of the arch that's been constructed. So basically, they got rid of everything except for the old cathedral. They weren't going to knock that down, thankfully.
Yeah, because the old cathedral was under. I think it's still owned by the Catholic Church, obviously. So I mean, they couldn't knock it down even if they wanted to.
Yeah, Space Squatch says early American settlers in Missouri, especially in the South, are heavily related to Appalachian Scots-Irish culture, and that's true. But then mid 19th century, mid 1800s, you get a lot of Germans coming in. So we have like Herman, Missouri, which we also like to visit, and that German culture is very strong. In fact, my wife has the maiden name Dimpewolf, if that doesn't sound German enough for you there. Okay. Okay. Just seeing if there's any last comments I want to throw in there. Oh, Space Squatch says mea culpa, it's 14th century for Cahokia. That sounds a little more like it. Because I think by the time the Europeans came, the Mississippian civilization had already, whatever bad happened to it, we don't really know, but it fell apart.
Yeah, that's what I remember too.
Thank you very much, Seneca. Awesome. I am going to forward this to once we get this done. I'm going to forward this to George Bagby, who's been doing a series. You told me about this, right? Been doing a series with Jay Burden on, like, he's got one on the Scots Irish. What are the other ones? Do you remember the other ones? Basically, he's talking about some of the different populations.
Yeah, so there's George Bagby and Jay Burden have been doing a very extensive series of streams on the different ethnic traditions in the United States. I know that they've done the Scots Irish, but I think the only other one they've done so far is the Puritans.
They have plans to do more. So
they have plans to do more.
Yeah, so that fits very much into what we've done here, and so I thought I'd forward this to George Bagby. Maybe they can mention it for those who are interested in the French part of the story, because it sounds like they're kind of doing British Isles type stuff. But who knows? Who knows how much they'll cover? So, or maybe they'll just steal from this, which would be fine because we're all friends. Okay, well, thank you very much, Seneca. You did a lot of great prep and gave us 2 hours to go over this material. So interesting. And like I said in that speech, know your ground. Even if you are, your family is a somewhat more recent arrival to the area that you live in now, I think it is smart to get to know the area that you're in, wherever that is. That's why I said know your ground. Whatever your ground is right now, try to understand a bit about what happened in the past that resulted in the people that are around you. And as I mentioned, once you learn a little bit about that, more things start sticking out to you, right?
Exactly.
Because I was curious about the French, I'm sure that had something to do with the fact that I ended up finding out that this guy's grandmother spoke French to him. if I hadn't been known about that history, I wouldn't have picked up on that detail, right? So once you get some of this history and context, you start noticing more some things in the names that are still around of towns and stuff, right? There's echoes of that past all around you, and you start tuning into that a bit more. And I think there's great value in this.
Yeah.
Okay,
Do you mind if I
that's
have a
all.
couple of last comments before
Oh,
you
you
go?
do. You have last comments. Go ahead.
I have a couple of last comments. So I want to thank you, Radlib, for allowing me to come on the stream and to talk about a passion of mine.
Yeah.
I'm very sad that in high school I was never really taught any of this or really any of Missouri history. It's been a passion of mine recently since I discovered Dwayne Meyer's book there at the top.
Mm-hmm.
Because like all you ever hear about of Missouri is simply, Lewis and Clark and
You're right.
guerrilla war and the Civil War, and that's about it.
Yeah.
It's like you said, knowing your ground is very important. Learn and dive into the events that happened in your states. I encourage your audience to do this as well. Like find a book, find your local historical society, find anything, even just going to a museum. Find that thing that'll light the fire for you to start investigating your own states. This is the reason why I do this and why I do write a Substack, by the way. Bellum Nostre, if anyone wants to go check it out. Yes, I do have a Substack.
Yeah, I
But
should
anyway,
put that in the show notes, right?
yeah,
I will
I'll
do
give
that.
it to you after the
I
show.
will do that. I'll find it.
So, I encourage all of you to go and find like just the little out of the way things about your own states. It'll really it makes things far more exciting to know that yes, you have a history. You have your own heroes, you have your own wars and battles that have been fought in your own backyard. There is greatness there. And it'll make living in your own states far more exciting. It'll give you a piece of history to call your own. We often talk about the United States, like in our college courses and in our high school classes, but it always kind of felt impersonal to me because it's so abstract, it's so far away. It makes more sense, I guess, if you're living in DC, but it doesn't really when you're so far removed from the centers of power. And I also do want to thank your audience for showing up and for coming out here, for example, as well, to learn about, maybe something that doesn't really apply to you, but I hope eventually sparks the fire in your own hearts as well, to learn about your own local histories.
Yeah. I have added your Substack to the show notes. So go to YouTube and you can find that. And I notice that you have a number of articles on Missouri. List of Missouri governors.
The one I'm most proud
Missouri's
of
Honey War. Oh, wait, Missouri Giants.
Yes.
Which one do you particularly want to call out?
The ones that I would like to call out is the one I'm most proud of is the Missourian Giants one, particularly the one I did on Thomas Hart Benton. Little known senator, but one that's very, very powerful in shaping early Missouri. I do plan on releasing many more articles in the future. Mine's relatively new. I've just been getting into it, and I've kind of been on hiatus for the last kind of couple weeks because holidays and everything like that. But if you guys want to go and subscribe, I would greatly appreciate it.
Cool. Excellent. And I should have already done this, but I'll just go ahead and toss this into the live chat too, because I can do that. So yeah, there's your Substack there. And my friend was listening. That's awesome. I see in the chat. Okay. All right. Thanks again, Seneca. Really good. And it looks like you can dig deeper by following his Substack on this subject. So it looks very interesting. All right, and let's see. I need to press the button and do the credits and all that. Okay, thanks everybody. Should be back with Black Horse, I believe, next week.